The best case scenario is that Ukraine breaks the Russian land bridge to Crimea. Military experts are very far from confident about Ukraine doing that. So that might take a catastrophic Russian collapse, military collapse, as a result of which Crimea might be left in a very vulnerable position. And the sheer vulnerability of Crimea, even short of Ukraine beginning to take it, might create a revolution in the Kremlin and get rid of the Putin regime. That is a good version of an ultimate victory for Ukraine. It's a very disturbing version because of just how much needs to happen, right? And I've incorporated into that version regime change in Moscow. And that is what is so strange. It's typically an insupportably hawkish position to sit around in London or Washington and fantasize about regime change somewhere because it serves our interests. But the reality is that this is an occasion in which we can say that that would be a good thing, whether it should be our aim or not, and that indeed it's the only way of guaranteeing Ukraine's security. If the Putin regime, for instance, somehow manages to stay in power after losing Crimea, which is not easy to imagine, why would it stop firing weapons onto Ukrainian territory? Or why would it not start firing weapons onto Ukrainian territory in years to come? So that's a kind of a best case scenario. What's a worst case scenario? Well, the existence of Ukraine and the independence of Ukraine is not under short-term risk. So short-term loss of Kiev is not a possibility at all. But what would the worst case scenario nevertheless look like? It might look like marginal gains for Ukraine, followed by stalemate, followed by loss of Western support, followed by loss of democratic leadership and partial loss of democratic institutions in major Western countries, followed in the late 2020s or in the early 2030s by a second Russian invasion of Ukraine, perhaps at that time with more prospect of succeeding, followed by a further Russian escalation against a NATO country. That's worst case scenario. So both of these scenarios have a non-zero chance of materializing, we have to admit that. There is, of course, an extra worst case scenario that I don't mention on this occasion, and that's some kind of escalation that pulls NATO into direct confrontation with Russia, leading to strategic nuclear exchange and the end of global civilization. There's a non-zero chance of that too. So we'll be looking really between the first two options, and I mean between the first two options, something in the middle is what we most plausibly are going to face. And how close we get to this ultimate victory scenario for Ukraine is paradoxically dependent on what we do. So there is this kind of unbelievable spectatorial attitude that we have toward Ukraine's counteroffensive, which is we're going to see how it goes, and that is then going to shape our next strategic steps. And it is an important question. We'll be asking it on the main channel. Why is it that our approach is to such an extent shaped by what Ukraine does, rather than it being the case that we are putting Ukraine in a position to get much closer than it perhaps can at the moment to simply winning this war, because that serves our interests. Now, of course, we are limited in at least two ways. One sphere of escalation that is very dominant in Washington and in London too, let alone in Paris and other capitals. But there is also the fact that we live in a democracy, and we'll be talking about that more explicitly too, right? If there is not democratic will to sustain support for Ukraine, we can't do it. And paradoxically, the best way of sustaining democratic will is to witness Ukraine doing well and to see what we might want being actually possible and being in the process of happening. That might get us to sustain, if not escalate, helping Ukraine evict Putin's brutal and imperialistic invasion. So I didn't want to move any big pieces on this occasion, but I just wanted to share this little chat in anticipation of not just ongoing conversations we're going to have about this, but also in anticipation of a major piece I want to share on the main channel that frames this. Lots of love, and thank you for walking with me. I've never walked with you before. I rarely walk in the last couple of years, so it's been a pleasure.